objections? Send a chat or something if you feel like there's something that you want to discuss. We can pause recording too if it's necessary during the meeting if you want to make a comment that you don't want to be on the official record. Okay. Welcome to our July 22nd Cardea user group meeting. We are operating under the auspices of the Linux Foundation, and so we're following their antitrust policy, which is can be shown at the link on your screen. Camila, can you share the meeting notes with?
I was just about to do that. Yep.
Thank you. So the basics of the antitrust policy are to not discuss pricing or business particular opportunities or sales types of conditions, anything that might be construed as not promoting competition. So that policy can be found at the Linux Foundation's website at the link provided. We also operate under our own Cardea Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct basically states, to summarize, that all are welcome. No membership is required. Be nice to others. People have a voice here and should be able to express their opinion. If they don't want to talk, they can submit comments or questions in the chat, and those are recorded along with the meeting. If you have problems with anybody violating the antitrust policy, please raise your hand, and we'll try to ascertain whether or not we should stop that topic of conversation to avoid problems there. If you have problems with the Code of Conduct, contact either Keela or myself. If you have a problem with Keela or myself, please contact the Linux Foundation directly, and they will make sure that that everyone is treated fairly and that we are being inclusive. With that, I'll pause for introductions. Anyone who would like to introduce themselves today that has not introduced themselves in the last few weeks or is new to the call? And most of the names that I see on the attendee list are familiar names, so let's move on to Playbook review. This is a mechanism for communicating what we're doing. There has been some criticism of the Cardea group for not for doing the great work, but for making sure that our message is being clearly communicated, or what our objectives are and how people participate and where we're going. So we're going to start probably on a monthly basis reviewing our playbook. The playbook contains our goals and our progress towards those goals to help clearly communicate our progress. So this is our July 22nd version of the playbook. As a summary, we want to express, what our overall objectives of the Cardea working group are. We have code that exists and everything, but this is the so what. What is it? Cardea is a way to share health status information in a way that protects privacy. That's the main essence of it. It can support international travel, as well as many other use cases, in a way that allows for each of the participants to benefit without increasing liability for either the issuers or the verifiers, because the data is held in the user's wallet. We're trying to drive adoption of decentralized identity and making it easier to share that health information in a privacy-preserving way. And we're also trying to drive additional development and encourage other people to come participate. You don't have to necessarily participate just on the code side. You may be wanting to join the community to provide use cases, or you may want to join the community to have interoperable software that's proprietary, that interacts with the Cardea ecosystem in a way that that enhances and grows the community, but isn't necessarily a contribution to the open source code itself. We're hoping that we can have more coders who are working on the actual code to help enhance its functionality, but we want to bring that back to the world and have use of the technology help make life better for people around the planet. We have some goals for the year. I think we'll dig into those a little deeper on each of the subcategories we're on the next few slides. So in community development, we're looking to try to get a total of 50 contributors in our first year to the development of a more final product, and both from the technical and non-technical side. So if you're somebody who writes documentation or can help with marketing or press releases, that's also a contribution that we're looking for. We want to implement. Go ahead.
I apologize for interrupting. Can I make a comment? Can you add the word goals to this slide?
Where would you like it? Right over here?
That would be wonderful. Because it wasn't clear on my read of that these were the goals.
Excellent. So we're looking to try to get 50 contributors into the ecosystem. We're looking to implement use cases on both the healthcare, travel, and government side. Some of those might involve a single group or deployment, and others might be individual projects that issue, for instance, a health status credential, but they don't necessarily involve themselves directly with the travel situation. And we want to have a deployment on every single continent for every single one of these healthcare, travel, and government in operation by the end of the year. Our technical goals is that we want to set up our first set of interoperability standards, or to say, here's the things that you need to do to be interoperable with the system, so that people can clearly identify where a proprietary solution might tie into this, or another ecosystem could tie in and interoperate. We want to establish machine readable governance as a thing, and we want to help GCCN establish the use of machine readable governance in their network. We also want to stand up a fully operational public reference implementation for both test and demonstration purposes. The demonstration purposes let people see how it works, and the test allows for people to try it out and interact with it with other wallets, other issuers, other verifiers. Questions on the technical goals? I should have paused at the previous slide as well.
I have some questions about how we plan to interact with the playbook, if I can interject with those, or do you want me to wait till the end, Ken?
No, you can. That's fair game. It's supposed to be more interactive than it is right now. Right now, it's me.
Excellent.
Blah, 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 blah.
So my first question is, do we plan to share this anywhere?
Yes.
And where will that be? Do we know yet?
It will be on the same website that we're putting all of the other promotional materials. This doesn't lend itself to a easy check-in, check-out from the GitHub repos, so it'll be updated on the website rather than
the Cardea.app website.
Yes.
Excellent. And then we said we're going to review it monthly.
Yes.
This is a discussion for what we want on it, or is this being communicated based on steering and other agendas?
This came mostly from the steering committee, but if you don't like what you see, then you should raise your hand and say, well, I don't want to do that. Or, hey, you missed an important goal. And then we can discuss it as a community and then take it back to the steering committee. And also the steering committee is basically like the pirate code. They're trying to provide guidelines and point us in the right direction. But the community has a voice in all of this and can say, we really think that we need to do something in particular and we can add something. And so it's meant to be interactive. If we achieve a goal, so like next time when we say, hey, we want 50 contributors, I want to get a measure of how many people have contributed to the code base so far. And then we'll have to keep like a little running count over on the side to see how well we're moving toward getting that goal accomplished. But that's the idea, is that this, initially it's pretty boring because you're setting out where you want to go, but not measuring a whole lot of progress. And so this go around is less interactive than I'd like it to be.
Great. And then if that is part of what we'll do, which is wonderful, because I think measuring and checking ourselves on are we doing a good job in that direction is really important. Some of these might need a little bit further definition. So for example, help establish GCCN use of machine readable governance. How do we measure success? What does success mean in that item?
Yeah, so success, and we can add more detail to these. This is kind of high level, but uh, it would be good as we go through. So since nobody's seen this before, they haven't had a chance to react or respond to it. But when we get it out and published, then people can make notes and say, this needs more clarification, or look for comments and suggestions on to help clarify. And we can take parts of these and discuss them in more detail in any particular meeting where we want to break them down. We could rotate through the playbook and do one section at a time. There's basically 4 sections here of goals, and we can talk about one section each meeting, or we can wait and just do a short discussion and overview once a month. An overview once a month, I think, is less distracting than interrupting every single meeting.
Bill, did you have a comment?
Yeah, you mentioned it on the last one, stand up a fully operational public reference implementation of a test and a demo net, of that. And I think that's your account of measure, or how you're going to measure it. Well, it's done and it's running. So that I think further clarification, you're exactly right. Need to be built out, but yeah, first time seeing it, I like it.
Yeah, the idea is to let people know how they can interact with the core developers who've been working on it the whole time. They know what they want to do, but the rest of the community is kind of seeing it for the first time. And so trying to find out, are these adequate goals, or are there points that we've missed? We've tried to highlight the key elements, but is a reference implementation useful? I think it is, but that's my opinion. But we're happy to adjust these goals and add to them, or when we complete one, we'll take it off here and say done, and it's off the technical goal chart. We also have our roadmap that has a myriad of details about nitpicky little things like update the Akapi server to version 0.7. That's an interesting goal, but probably a little too specific for the overall project goals. But a category of interoperability is one of the key things that we were looking for. Machine readable governance is another broad category. And then how do we test? And so those were kind of, I made everybody boil this down to 3 objectives, along with the suggestions from everyone. But let's pick out our key goals and try to keep it between 3 and 5 on a particular area at a time. And when we achieve goals, we'll mark them done and move on to the next ones. But it'll help guide our the community development, and that's part of what we're trying to do by putting it. We could just make an open source repo and never talk to anybody else about it, and that would be great. It's an open source project, but the community involvement is key. And so feedback from people to say, yep, I like that goal, or that one's not so interesting to us. Let's replace it with something else.
Okay.
Thanks for your feedback. On our training, one of the problems that exist in many of the open source projects that I've worked with in the past is a lack of training. So there's this huge project, it's complicated, or it's got lots of functions in it, but if you can't figure out how to use it, it discourages adoption. And so one of the key areas that I wanted to focus on was training, and providing a training program to get new developers up to speed as they participate in Cardea's development. Idea was there for a certification program, so that if somebody has completed the training and an organization is looking to hire someone to help them out, then if they have completed the developer training, then they're a better candidate than someone who's never looked at the code before. And then creating user documentation for the different roles in implementing the Cardea system in different industries. So if I'm an issuer, what do I do? If I'm a government, what do I do with this thing? How do I make use of it, and how do I interact with it in a way that will bring benefit to my customers or my citizens or the people that I'm serving. Any comments on the training goals? I'd like everybody to take the training goals and take them back and substitute Cardea for your other open source projects and go try to implement them there as well. I find that that's a real stumbling block to picking up many open source projects. Comments?
Do you want to, can you add goals to training here too at the top?
Yeah. Oh, yep.
I'm making all the changes to the master document, so you don't need to do it in real time.
Thanks, Trevor.
Okay, marketing and PR. A open source project that's written in the woods, and if it delivers something, does anybody care? Let's get the message out. So we wanted a comprehensive messaging strategy around Cardea and the multiple use cases that it can satisfy. Create the marketing materials so that we can drive adoption, and work with the Linux Foundation Public Health also to engage with other organizations and projects. So it's how do we get the word out? Provide ongoing marketing support, updating our website, our calendar, our meeting notes, videos, and documentation. Right now, I think we've got the meeting notes and videos well taken care of. The calendar is now finally in the Linux Foundation's calendar system. Our documentation is pretty sparse, and our website updates are getting better, but could use some work. Comments or questions on marketing and PR?
I think my comment is on the materials to describe the audience. Materials for whom? Not the end user, right? It's going to be materials for implementer. I think it would be important to call out the audience for this material.
I think there are multiple audiences, and that's part of the challenge.
I agree, Ken. I think you're exactly right. You have two different audiences here. If the second one talks about Linux Foundation and who they're engaging, then the other one is the actual support from the developers, an audience.
The developers are one audience. The Linux Foundation and their partners is another audience. The end users, so health systems, issuing credentials, governments is another audience, and then why verifying organizations might want to participate. I think we have 5 audiences at least that are, and that's why making a project like this successful needs to address each of those constituencies. We also have in the Playbook set of links. I want to take the links out and put them on the website instead of in the Playbook. I think that they are useful, but maybe this is the wrong spot for them.
They're already on the website. More.
Okay. So
I agree, though. There's more likely to be a misalignment or oopsies, we didn't update it in all the places that it's documented. So reducing the redundancy there would probably be a good idea.
the links can go in our marketing materials, they can go on our website, but I think in our goals section, I think we can move them out. Any other thoughts on what we're doing? So do you like this? Do you not like this? What changes would you make to our Playbook approach? Stunned silence.
May I just throw in, I saw that there's quite a few websites listed, but there wasn't any one particular one saying, if you need help or you'd like to know more about this, contact. Is that a valid suggestion?
That might be a good link to have in the goals and objectives deck, where to go to find out more. Good suggestion. Other suggestions or comments? Excellent. This, I think, is a good approach. For the next item on our, we'll be reviewing our playbook in about a month from now. So give or take, depending on what other items we run into with our agendas, meeting agendas, and scheduling time. Next up on our agenda is some schema review, and I'm going to turn the time back over to Keela to lead that discussion.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just gonna, if you can stop sharing and I will start sharing. Fabulous. Okay, so we've been spending a lot of time on schemas, rightfully so. There's a lot to consider. So we're going to start hopefully with the easy one. Last we met, we discussed vaccine exemption schemas. So let me pause and just say the reason we're spending so much time on schemas is that locking down the plan is really important to be able to support our next topic for today, which is machine readable governance. So we need to build some parameters on which we can use to build that logic. And the more discussion we have on schemas, the better they'll be and the less likely they will be to change in the future, hopefully. So we spoke on the exemption schema last time. There was a comment about managing a guardian who authorized or requested to get the exemption. And I took that feedback and I drafted this row here in orange. Hopefully you can all see this. And I called it the exemption requester. My thought was it would be the name of the person who requested it if it's not the patient themselves. So if it were someone else, then their name could go here. I remember that Jeffrey had some comments that this would probably not necessarily be applicable in their universe, but others may care about the who got it. Would having just the requester name be sufficient? For example, this doesn't have the relationship of the requester to the patient. And is that important?
The purpose for including, the exemption requester is so that you can do what? Why do we want the exemption requester's name in there? What actions are likely to be taken using that information?
Yeah, so you could imagine, or the scenario that I could imagine, let me correct that, is in the event that the person who has legal decision powers over somebody's medical care changes, right? There's some family dispute. That person has now been changed from one person to another. This exemption was perhaps authorized by the old person that is no longer authorized to make these kinds of requests. That's a scenario that I could envision happening. I'm not sure if others have experience or ideas about an exemption and what might go wrong and why you need to know who requested it.
Well, may I just point out that if we're going to go down this road, it is very possible that somebody is giving out exemptions so that somebody else does not need to go to the bother of getting vaccinated. And it could turn out that Jane Jones or Bob Biddle was doing that because she or he was getting $30 a head for exempting people from tests and COVID vaccinations. So everybody that Bob Biddle or Jane Jones exempted needs to be unexempted, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I think that would be covered by the exemption credential, either the exemption credential issuer or the medical physician that issued the credential. If we discover that this specific doctor, you can go and say, you know, I'm allergic to the clouds, and they give you an exemption to the vaccine, then all of their exemptions go into question. This is the, and maybe the language isn't clear. This is the person who asked. It's not the patient themselves. It's the person who asked that doctor or government or whomever to issue it.
Giving a real world use case that would apply, for example, a school asking for an exemption for your child. They would have a parent signature, for example.
Correct. In which case the parent name would be here. Or if you had an elderly parent that you had the power of attorney and you were there, I forget the word, the healthcare proxy for, where you make the healthcare decisions for that person, you may be the requester for your parent also, for example.
So I have two comments. One is this schema is meant to, and the vaccine schema, both the exemption and the vaccine are not strictly COVID specific. These need to cover any kind of vaccine, and exemptions are a very important part of the law and the workflow for vaccines outside of just COVID. And so this needs to be a part of the ecosystem if it's going to apply to your standard vaccination systems. The other thing to keep in mind here is that if you have governance is going to be a very important part of how this is all implemented. And so in order to be a valid issuer, you would have to abide by the rules of governance for, what vaccines are issued and how exemptions would be issued. And if you have a bad actor who's not playing by the rules, then they can be removed from the list of approved issuers, and the credentials that they've issued can be tracked down by the issuer ID, the DID that's associated with the issuer, and if necessary, revoked.
So they can be handled in two different ways to remove bad actors. One is to remove their trusted issuer from the governance, and the second is through revocation, as Mike has indicated. But the idea that, like Mike mentioned, this is broader than, this is not just a COVID vaccination or a COVID exemption. These are applicable to many types of vaccinations, and they're both medical, and there's lots of reasons why an exemption might need to be issued. Allergy to a particular type of constituent component of a vaccine is one. Medical condition that precludes administration of a vaccine because of poor health at the time, or a chronic condition that precludes that, or there may be other reasons for exemptions to be granted. And these are all part of the existing legal frameworks in many jurisdictions, and that's why we're trying to address this here, to make sure we have a comprehensive solution that addresses the broad scope of vaccinations and their exemptions. COVID is a single example and a critical one for the current time frame, but is not the only use case.
So in the interest, we have a couple of things to review. So in the interest of time, are there other comments on capturing the requester? I did add relationship. I think if we're going to capture requester, we might as well add who is that person to the subject of the credential. Is the language good? Sorry, go ahead, Ken.
I think the language is good, and I think that I envision that there are multiple reasons you'd want to know, particularly in the case of guardianship, whether for minor children or for people rendered incapable of making their own decisions, to know who to contact in case there's questions about the credential, and to help. This may or may not be important to an airline. they take it or they leave it, but it may be useful for further relationship exploration to find out and perhaps discuss what has happened or why it's happened, or if there's a change in status or something like that. And so I find it useful to provide this information to the individual. Typically, the in those cases, the credential is going to be issued probably to the guardian, because the person who is either underage or is incapacitated in some way. So it's likely that the credential will be issued and held by somebody who's not the subject of the credential. So it may or may not be useful, but as you're presenting this data to, for instance, to the school or to an airline or somebody, they need to have this information on file to facilitate further interaction.
Any other comments? Again, we're on the exemption schema to add these two data points. Okay. Okay, we had previously sort of brushed over the lab result schema. So I'm going to jump to that one. We have not reviewed this recently in great lengths, but we have some items that came up. The first, which is the easiest, I think, for us to discuss today, is the patient email. So we had a bunch of demographic data here, adding patient email. This is across the board on all the schemas, so it would be part of the demographics. Are there any objections or comments on adding a patient email to the set of demographics?
I have one comment on the patient email. I agree. Yeah, it probably needs to be there. But the question is it changes. A lot of patients will have multiple emails. How will the system handle different emails for a single patient? Of course, you see what I'm saying? I have 5
Yes.
different emails myself.
Can we have a delimiter, Ken? I think we can.
We can have, it is possible to delimit and put in multiple email addresses. This is a case where multiple entries in a single field is probably okay. There's not like 3 fields that have to maintain correlation between them. That's a complicated mess, but this is not one of those. Are there any other, does anybody see a problem with using a delimited set of email addresses?
I would comment that phone could also have multiple, right? You have your home phone, your cell phone, or your work phone.
It's possible to list multiple phones in a similar fashion. Choosing an appropriate delimiter in the phone cases chosen with care. I think a delimited list is possible there as well.
Any other comments on email? Otherwise, I would propose, so go ahead.
I was going to say these, it's good to recognize that while convenient, since people's emails and phones change on a somewhat regular basis, if you need reliable, up-to-date information for those fields, we may actually want to talk about other KYC or types of credentials, et cetera, to keep in touch with someone and verify those. But they're certainly convenient at the time of issuance here.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, Mike, is that email is a correlated identifier, but not an authoritative identifier of permanent email or permanent phone number registration is how they should be considered.
Right. The information is somewhat transitory. It changes. And so, your vaccine credential may last forever because you don't become unvaccinated, but your email address may be different in 2 to 5 to 10 years. And so you can't rely on this email address to be 100% accurate forever. Just keep that in mind when using it.
Agreed. I think that it still has value at this point in time and to determine who is this the right person?
Agreed.
Well, I think that brings up a bigger problem, and that is most of the demographics are transitory in the sense that most people don't live at the same street address their entire life.
Right.
Agreed. It's a point in time data point for sure.
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. Any other comments on email? Otherwise, we'll move on. And this again is across all of our schemas. We've added email. Okay, so on the lab schema, One data, or two really data points that came into question are sending facility and visit location. And I'm not sure that they have a tremendous amount of value in the schema. They matter. I care about them as data points, but I don't know that they matter in this schema. And this would describe, for example, the organization that aggregated, maybe not the right word, the lab result. So the lab and the facility that ordered it. The lab is the one who performs the lab, and we'll discuss that in a minute. But the facility that ordered it is then the one that might be either issuing the credential, or maybe they're sending it to a health information exchange or a central repository that is then issuing the credential from there. Does tracking that organization matter? When we have who ordered the lab, who performed the lab, and the credential issuer. Does an intermediary of types matter in this scenario? Are there any opinions on that?
Well, give us an example of the organizations that might fit each of those things, and I think that might help shed some light on the discussion.
Excellent. So in the universe that I spend most of my time in, you have, let's say you have a small provider practice. That small provider practice becomes the ordering facility for the lab test. They then they either draw the blood or do the swab or whatever kind of lab test this is. They might do that in their office, or they might say, oh, you have to go, downstairs to the lab and they'll do it for you. Then that gets sent out to the lab that's going to perform the test. They're the ones that are spinning the blood or running the COVID test or whatever the case may be. That's, in this scenario, the performing lab. And then the chain of custody for the electronic record is that the lab then issues an electronic result to this ordering facility's electronic medical record. This is assuming that we're in electronic land here. That becomes then, so the lab now sent the result to the doctor's office. That doctor's office is connected in this scenario to a health information exchange that is aggregating healthcare data for perhaps the state or the region or the country. This sending facility is the identifier of the doctor's office or doctor organization that sent the credential issuer, who's going to be the HIE in this scenario, the data. So I feel like it's a little redundant to the ordering provider because it's likely the same. And we had it on here, but I would kind of think we could remove it. Similarly, visit location is when they had a doctor's visit that resulted in the creation of a lab order, or they swabbed or whatever, where was the patient? Were they in the primary care office? Were they at an orthopedic office? I don't think that matters in terms of what happens with the lab test results. You have a lab test and it is what it is. And it's a little bit complicated of a subject, and there's a lot of moving parts.
We care about the doctor or the organization that ordered the test. We care about the organization that did the test. You're saying we don't particularly care about any intermediates that transferred the electronic record, but we do care about who actually issued the credential, because we need to go back to them and trust them. And we may need to go back to them and say, hey, is your data correct? And so there may be multiple reasons to contact the issuer. We need to know who did the test and who ordered the test, but not necessarily other parties.
Correct. And you have the ordering facility identifiers, which are likely to be redundant to this guy up here. Likely, not guaranteed, but likely. So I would remove these because they may cause confusion in what they mean, in which case they may mean multiple things, and then it's hard to build governance on that.
I would vote for removal. I don't think they establish extra validity for the credential. And I think that the information there is not going to be useful frequently and can be discovered other ways for the context in which it might be important.
Are there other opinions? Okay. Please chime in if you're just a little behind and you're still thinking about it. That's fine. You can interject anytime. The next discussion point that I wanted to raise is on the lab specimen type and whether or not this is something that we should document and if it's enough for us to document just this one thing. So specimen type, for example, is it blood or saliva? For example, you can run an HIV test either using blood serum or saliva. Now, one comment is that the lab code, which is the unique identifier for what lab test was run, is typically different depending on whether or not it was a blood test or a saliva test, because the lab codes, if we're talking about LOINC specifically, define the protocol for how that test is performed, and that protocol is different for each of those. So the test can tell you, but having that as a discrete value, is that helpful? The specimen type. Are there opinions? And Kim, I believe this was to be compatible with something else that did have specimen type.
RJ might have opinions on this.
RJ, do you have an opinion? Or comment?
Sorry, guys, I didn't hear the statement. I apologize.
That's okay. The question is, does lab specimen type as a data point, i.e. blood versus saliva, is that important to have in a lab test credential?
So the answer is yes. So that does come through with one of our partners. I can get more details on it for everybody.
So RJ, the particular question is because the LOINC code or the equivalent code typically embeds the specimen type, do we need a separate field that also specifies it in like English words?
I don't know the answer to that. I can do the homework and find out for us. I can go right to our labs and confirm with them. I don't know it offhand.
Okay.
In the schema, they might have both listed, but if they don't need the second field, then it makes our credential slightly smaller and a little bit more manageable.
Okay, I will ask. I'll find out for it.
Okay, then we've expanded from our like way old V1 concept here to add more detail around the ordering facility. So these fields match across schemas, the data points that we're collecting. I would just call out that I'm calling these IDs. So it's ordering facility ID and ID qualifier instead of code and code qualifier. And then of course we have the name, which it would be a human readable name. Same with performing lab. So I called this performing laboratory as to not confuse it with the fact that this is a lab test credential. And this is who performed the test, who spun the blood or analyzed the COVID result or whatever that is. Same data points. Another question that arose is the equipment. So we had a little debate offline about whether or not the lab that performed the test was sufficient to validating the result, or whether knowing the specific machine that it was run on and whether that machine was certified is important. I did call a friend at a big lab company, and they said that their machines do get certified, and that they have a very robust tracking system for knowing what happens with each lab result and where it went and what it was tested on and which equipment was used, etc. I'm not sure that that impacts our credential, but it is something that the labs track. Are there any thoughts on whether or not the equipment, there's something about the equipment that we should be tracking in this credential? My experience with the data is that it's not available in the data that I've seen. I'm sure that the lab has that detail, and maybe if the lab directly were issuing this credential, they could provide this.
So RJ, working with you on this again, I believe your particular record had this on there, and we're wondering if this is a requirement or just something that they thought might be useful or helpful.
Let me go back. Okay, so we a lot of things to say on this one, because I know that it's on there, but I don't know if it's a system that they like to do. What my concern is, at some point we can't track everything. We have to rely on the certification process to be a lab, and that's who tracks it. And so you just have to have a level of, if they meet the requirements to be a certified lab, all that stuff is fallen in through their certification. We don't need to track it in the credential. But
That's exactly my opinion as well, RJ.
Yeah. So let me just, I think we need, well, I'm not an expert, but based on, I think everyone believes that's the case. Let me do a little bit more homework with them and tell them that it won't be in the credential and see what kind of pushback I get. I think it just might be a scenario that they put together their own schema based on being trailblazers. So let me have that as an action item as well.
Okay. Are there any other thoughts or opinions on that?
The only thought or opinion I have, this bill again, that could be a customer specific custom change to the schemas for them, instead of at the at our for what we're trying to accomplish here. I think that's a custom.
No, я просто сейчас,
That's just my thoughts.
Okay. The next question is on who actually pulled the specimen. So this is, for example, if you walked into the doctor's office and they hand you the COVID swab and they say, you do it, or who pulled the blood, does that matter? To anyone?
Keel, I'm sorry for being late with this, but it took
That's
a little
okay.
bit of coordination among several people and languages and so forth. The statement in Kazakhstan was regarding performing equipment, that once you specify the exam, once you specify the test, with most of these laboratory procedures, you're already specifying the equipment. Unless the company is using out of date equipment, they need to certify or specify the equipment being used. Seems redundant, considering how much other information is already on the schema, which is up to 48 or 46 lines. So.
Great, thank you.
Sure, sorry.
That's okay.
On who pulled the specimen, I think that, again, it doesn't really add a lot of validity or to the the value of the schema. It's the kind of thing where if you need to know that person, you'd have to contact the lab, and that would only be like, I don't really see how it contributes to whether this is a valid credential or not.
I tend to agree. Are there other opinions? If the patient swabs themselves, do you consider that any less of a valid test? In the COVID example?
The answer would be probably not if it's allowed as part of the testing procedure. If it's explicitly not allowed, if you must have a trained professional to do it, then that's part of the certification process as well, I would think.
Okay, so this one I'm going to suggest that we remove. And we have a few follow-ups on the others. Ken, we're a little tight on time. Do you want me to go to the order schema or do you want to touch on governance?
No, it's more important, I think, to nail down our schemas. And I think that that's causing some people consternation and lack of ability to make progress. So let's focus in on those and get them nailed down, and we'll deal with governance next time.
Okay. Okay, so we have a couple, RJ, that you're going to take back and double check on. I will suggest that we remove who actually did the swabbing or pulling of the blood. I did this review in this order on purpose. So we reviewed the lab results schema, but there are scenarios where there's also a lab has been ordered and that should be a credential, right? Maybe you can say, look, I got tested, I'm just waiting for my results. And so you're in this limbo phase where you're allowed to be in that phase. And so there's a need for a schema around that. So what I did was I took the lab results schema and I trimmed down all of the things that are actually the part of the result. So I would suggest that we make the same comments to remove these two things at the top, which we've already discussed. We have the patient, excuse me, here we go, the demographics. We added the email as we've discussed. The specimen collected date. There's this question about the specimen type. Now here it might be more important because you don't have the link code yet, potentially, unless people feel like we should add that because the order would include the specific test you want run.
I think it would be valuable to include the specific test that was ordered.
I think the LOIN code is more valuable than the text field that describes the sample type.
Okay, we'll see if Jeffrey has any comments on the order side of that. And whether you order a specific LOIN test or whether you order a COVID test and then the lab decides the protocol.
According to what our two doctors said, the laboratory is responsible for the results. So for example, who actually performed the lab is not that important. But what is important is that if you specify, for example, a PCR test, that's the only way that that is done. If you specify simply a COVID test, that's not enough information for the lab to make an analysis, because then they have to decide if it's an antibody test or a PCR test or whatever other kind of test, or rapid test. And so a properly specified test already does that.
And that would be in the order.
Yes.
Fabulous. So I've just gone ahead and added that. And so I've added these back in, which is the lab code, the qualifier for that code, and the name of the test. I also have a lab order ID, which would be important to link this lab order schema with the lab result schema, right? So I asked for the test, here's the test result, and they correlate to each other.
I would like to maybe propose that we don't actually call this a lab order ID. Perhaps this is more appropriately a in progress lab. And so I don't think we should issue this before the specimen or whatever has been collected, because the concept here would be to say, hey, I've gone in, I've had my sample taken, and now I'm waiting for the results, which is very different from I've gone to my doctor and he's ordered this test, but I'm just not going to show up.
Got it. And I think is it fair to say though, Kim, that distinction is at what point in the ordering process this schema gets issued?
That might be fair. That might be part of the governance part of this.
Also, you have a lab specimen collected date, so you would ideally know whether they've actually collected the sample or not based on the presence of this date. If it was an order where you're supposed to like take this piece of paper down the street to the lab and then get your blood drawn, then this would be empty.
That's fair. Maybe I don't know the proper terms. When a lab takes a test result, is it considered an order at that point, or is it considered another type of state?
I think it would still be an order until the results are in, but I could do some digging on that as well. If the lab is the one that actually does the draw or the specimen collection, is that test then in progress pending the spinning of the result or whatever test they run?
I just wanted to clarify. I just wanted to make sure that we're clarifying here that this isn't like an order for a test in the future. This is like, I've already gone in and had my specimen collected. And I think it's valuable to differentiate that.
So I think we can differentiate that within the existing schema by populating the lab specimen collected date field. And that kind of is the boundary between I've ordered a test and it's sitting there and waiting to be done in the future. And now the test has been, the specimen has been collected and the test is underway. Is that
That's fair?
Or do you think that that's inadequate?
I just think it might cause confusion in the future if we're using a lab order schema that could be used in both directions. I think it might get misused potentially.
We could call it a specimen schema.
A lab specimen or a specimen schema?
Something like that.
Or
That would indicate that it's
a pending lab result or something like that.
Is there always a specimen with a lab?
I think the answer is yes.
Are there tests that don't involve specimens like an EKG? Is that also a test?
Yes, and that would have an order as well, but it wouldn't have a lab. We called this the lab order.
Are the other types of tests that don't have a specimen different name? So like the EKG, what is that called? It's not called a lab, it's just called a test or something else?
I'm okay saying that we could have Keela go do some research on this and come back and let us know.
Okay, I will do that. I think the other thing that it has other names in the US, it gets called an accession number. It's like they really call it an order, but I can do a little digging on that. But there are orders of different kinds. You can order a radiology test, for example.
There's no specimen, but there's an image taken.
There would be no specimen in that scenario. Okay, other comments? Otherwise, I think we've reviewed everything. We have a couple of points to go back and do some more research on. If anybody has comments offline or does some research, I would be happy to have a discussion with you about that. And then it seems like next week, Ken, we'll get this wrapped up hopefully quickly and then do the machine readable governance. Is that fair?
I think that's the appropriate order for things. I think it unblocks people the most. And so we'll do it in that order.
Okay, and RJ, if you want to dig into this further, let me know. We can have a discussion between now and then.
Yes, absolutely. What we'll do is I'll probably bring you in and I'll set up a call or two. Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Sorry we didn't get to the entire agenda today. My friendly cat has jumped on the table telling me it's time for my next meeting. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for your patience. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.